January 1942. Off the coast of Long Island, Kapitän-Leutnant Reinhard Hardigan peers through the periscope of U-123 at a coastline blazing with light. Street lamps, car headlights, neon signs. America has not bothered to turn off a single bulb. 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the eastern seaboard glows as if the war is someone else's problem. Hardigan does not hesitate. He torpedoes the tanker Norness in Rhode Island Sound, then 4 more ships off Cape Hatteras over the next 4 days. All against an illuminated coastline, all without submerging. The US Navy fires nothing in return. Years later, Hardigan will recall this moment to the Charlotte Observer with a single judgment. I was very surprised at the lack of maritime defenses. No blackouts, no dimming, nothing. What follows is what German submariners call the second happy time. Between January and August 1942, U-boats sink 868 Allied ships totaling 3.1 million tons of cargo, fuel and war material, the cost 42 submarines. June 1942 is the worst single month. 830,000 tons vanish beneath the Atlantic. Ships are torpedoed in broad daylight within sight of American beaches. 5,000 merchant seamen die in those 8 months alone, more than twice the number killed at Pearl Harbor. At U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France, Admiral Karl Dönitz studies the numbers and sees a mathematical certainty. His strategy rests on a single calculation: sink ships faster than the enemy can build them. Before America entered the war, that threshold was 300,000 tons per month. Now, with the US merchant fleet added to Britain's, it has doubled to 700,000. But Dönitz believes the threshold is reachable because American shipbuilding barely exists. In the entire decade of the 1930s, the United States Navy commissioned just 23 ships. Annual commercial output has fallen to its lowest level in over a century. 90% of America's merchant fleet is World War I surplus. And in 1941 and 1942 combined, Germany sinks 2,963 Allied vessels. America builds 863 replacements. The math is simple. As long as Dönitz can destroy tonnage faster than Allied shipyards can produce it, Britain starves, the Soviet Union fights without American tanks, and no invasion fleet ever crosses the English Channel. In early 1942, the math is on his side, but within 2 years, Dönitz's arithmetic will collapse, not because of a new weapon, not because of a code broken at Bletchley Park, not because of long-range aircraft closing the Black Pit. It will collapse because of a man who has never built a ship in his life. A dam builder from California who looks at a 441-foot cargo vessel and sees the same problem he once solved with concrete and steel on the Colorado River. He is not planning. He is already building. And now the only question left is whether American shipyards can outproduce the entire German submarine fleet. To understand why Dönitz believed he would win, you have to understand what he was looking at. American shipbuilding was not behind. It was dead. Between 1922 and 1937, the entire United States produced 2 ocean-going dry cargo ships. Not 200, not 20, 2. Annual tonnage output had dropped to its lowest point in more than a century. The workforce that had built transports during the last war had retired, scattered, or died. The yards that once lined the Delaware and the Hudson had rusted shut. By 1939, the country that would need to supply 2 oceans simultaneously could not build a single freighter in under 7 months. Adolf Hitler saw these numbers, and he drew a conclusion. Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments, recorded it in his memoir Inside the Third Reich. The Americans had not played a very prominent part in the war of 1914 to 1918. They would certainly not withstand a trial by fire, for their fighting qualities were low. In general, no such thing as an American people existed as a unit. They were nothing but a mass of immigrants from many nations and many races. Hitler was not alone in this assessment. His contempt rested on something real. America had no shipbuilding industry to speak of, no trained labor pool, and no tradition of mass naval construction since 1918. For a leader who had watched German yards build pocket battleships with precision engineering and skilled craftsmen. The idea that America could somehow close a 2,100 ship deficit was not worth serious discussion. Dönitz did not share Hitler's racism, but he shared his conclusion, and he arrived at it through arithmetic. The Tonnage War required one condition: sinkings must exceed construction. If Germany could destroy 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, no amount of American courage would matter. The ships would simply run out. The shipping of the enemy powers is one great whole. It is therefore immaterial where a ship is sunk. It must still, in the final analysis, be replaced by a new ship. This was not bluster. In the first half of 1942, his U-boats were sinking faster than every Allied shipyard combined could build. The deficit was not closing, it was widening. And if you had asked any neutral naval analyst in June 1942 whether the United States could reverse this equation, the honest answer would have been no. Not with the shipyards they have. Not with the workers they don't. In December 1940, while Hitler was dismissing American industrial capacity, and Dönitz was calculating how many ships he could sink per month, a man named Henry Kaiser won a government contract to build 30 cargo ships for the British. Kaiser had never built a ship. He had never worked in a shipyard. He had never hired a shipwright. His expertise was concrete. He'd spent the previous decade building the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, and the Bonneville Dam, three of the largest structures on Earth. When East Coast shipbuilders learned that a dam builder from Oakland had secured a maritime contract, their reaction was ridicule. When British and American officials heard how fast he planned to deliver, they thought he was delusional. Kaiser had heard doubt before. When a colleague once told him that Rome wasn't built in a day, his answer was immediate. "I don't know about that. I wasn't working on that job." He did not respond to the ridicule with arguments. He responded with a shipyard. He purchased empty mudflats on the Richmond shoreline of San Francisco Bay, and 78 days later the mudflats were a functioning shipbuilding facility with rail connections, crane gantries, and fabrication sheds. The first keel was laid in April 1941. His method was simple, and it was borrowed not from any maritime tradition but from Henry Ford. Traditional shipbuilding worked from the keel up. One crew of skilled craftsmen riveted steel plates together, piece by piece from bottom to top, over a period of 6 to 8 months. Kaiser looked at this process and saw the same inefficiency he had seen in dam construction before he reorganized it. His solution: stop building ships, start assembling them. He broke the 441-foot Liberty ship into prefabricated sections weighing up to 250 tons each. These sections were manufactured at factories scattered across the country, loaded onto railroad flat cars, and shipped to Richmond. At the yard, giant cranes lifted them into position, and welding teams fused them together. The 200-ton deckhouse was built separately, then lowered onto the hull by 4 cranes working simultaneously. Each finished vessel contained 250,000 parts weighing 14 million pounds, joined by 50 miles of welding seam. The results came fast. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to build. Within months, Kaiser's yards cut that to 45 days, then 27, then 14. The industry average was 230 days. Kaiser was building ships in less time than most yards spent on paperwork. But the true revolution was not speed. It was labor. Traditional riveting required 6 months of training. A rivet crew needed years of experience to work efficiently. Kaiser replaced riveting with welding. A welder could be trained in 2 weeks. This single change unlocked a workforce that no shipbuilder had ever considered. Women, African Americans from the rural South, wounded veterans, teenagers, anyone with 2 hands and the willingness to learn one specific task. Kaiser did not need craftsmen who could build an entire ship. He needed workers who could master one weld, one cut, one assembly, and repeat it thousands of times. He recruited across the country. Richmond's population exploded from 23,000 to 130,000 in 2 years. When there was nowhere for the workers to live, Kaiser built them a city. Vanport, Oregon, 9,942 housing units, 42,000 residents complete with schools, nurseries and a hospital. When workers fell sick, Kaiser created a prepaid healthcare system funded by payroll deductions. After the war, that system became Kaiser Permanente. The press gave him a nickname. Hurry up, Henry. His workers had a slogan of their own: build ships faster than the enemy can sink them. By 1943, the system Kaiser had designed reached full velocity across all 18 Liberty shipyards nationwide. The numbers were no longer incremental improvements. They were industrial detonations. Man-hours per ship dropped from 1.4 million to under 500,000. Cost per vessel fell from $2 million to under 1.7 million. And the production rate hit a pace that would have been dismissed as fantasy 12 months earlier. 3 Liberty ships completed every single day. Autumn 1942. At U-boat headquarters in Lorient, Dönitz reviews the latest intelligence reports and finds something that does not fit his arithmetic. His submarines are still sinking ships, the kill totals remain high, but the convoys are not shrinking. Crews from torpedoed vessels are reappearing at sea within weeks, manning ships that did not exist 2 months ago. For every hull his U-boats send to the bottom, another surfaces from an American shipyard and joins the next convoy. Dönitz's Tonnage War was built on one foundational assumption. There is a ceiling to how fast the enemy can build. Every industrial nation has one. Germany has one. Britain has one. The assumption was not reckless. It was based on centuries of shipbuilding reality. A cargo ship is a complex machine. It requires skilled labor, specialized facilities, and months of careful construction. No nation in history had ever mass-produced ocean-going vessels the way Ford mass-produced automobiles. Until now. In 1943, American shipyards launch over 11 million tons of merchant shipping. That single year's output exceeds the total tonnage Germany has sunk since the war began. The 700,000-ton monthly threshold that Dönitz calculated as the breaking point of Allied logistics is now meaningless. His U-boats achieve it only once, in November 1942. They will never reach it again. From December 1942 onward, Allied construction outpaces losses every single month. The deficit does not narrow, it inverts. The contrast between the two sides is no longer a gap, it is a chasm. German shipyards build U-boats the old way. 1 yard, 1 skilled crew, 1 vessel from start to finish. Kaiser builds cargo ships the new way. Hundreds of factories fabricating modules, railroads hauling them to assembly yards, semi-skilled workers welding them together in weeks. Germany sees shipbuilding as a craft. Kaiser sees it as a production line. By May 1943, Dönitz loses 38 U-boats in a single month. He reports to Hitler that the situation has become untenable and withdraws his submarines from the North Atlantic. In a signal to his commanders dated May 24th, he makes an admission that would have been unthinkable 12 months earlier. The enemy holds every trump card, covering all areas with long-range air patrols and using location methods against which we still have no warning. The enemy knows all our secrets and we know none of his. Dönitz blames aircraft and radar. He does not mention American shipyards. He does not mention Henry Kaiser. He does not mention that the United States is now launching 3 cargo ships per day. But that silence is itself an answer. When a man whose entire strategy depended on sinking ships faster than they could be built stops talking about construction rates, it means the numbers have become too large to argue with. Years later, at Nuremberg, Dönitz will finally describe what happened in terms that leave no room for reinterpretation. At the pinnacle of my success, it occurred to me that air power might someday stifle us and force us underwater. Thus, despite the huge successes which I still had at that time, my fears for the future were great. Even in defeat, he credits the airplane. He never credits the welder. November 8, 1942. 12:01 a.m. At Permanente Metals Corporation Yard No. 2 in Richmond, California, the keel plate of hull No. 440 is lowered onto the slipway. The ship has a name, SS Robert E. Peary. It has a deadline, beat the existing record of 10 days, set 2 months earlier by the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation with the SS Joseph N. Teal. What happens over the next 4 days will become the most famous feat of industrial production in American history. More than 1,000 workers rotate through around-the-clock shifts. Prefabricated sections weighing up to 250 tons arrive by rail and crane. Welding teams fuse 50 miles of seam. 250,000 individual parts totaling 14 million pounds are assembled into a single 441-foot vessel. On November 12th, the SS Robert E. Peary slides into the water. Time from keel to launch, 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. 3 days later, the Maritime Commission accepts the vessel as fully outfitted. On November 22nd, the Peary departs San Francisco carrying 10,000 tons of cargo bound for Noumea, New Caledonia. 14 days from bare slipway to open ocean with a full hold. The press calls it a stunt. Kaiser corrects them. This is not a stunt ship. This is an incentive ship. He means it. The Peary is not a trick performed once for cameras. It is a demonstration to 100,000 Richmond workers of what their system can do when every piece arrives on time and every shift performs at capacity. The yard's normal pace is already extraordinary. An average of 50 days per Liberty ship in late 1942, falling to under 3 weeks by 1944. The Peary simply proves the ceiling has not been reached, and the ceiling keeps rising. Richmond's 4 shipyards produced 747 vessels during the war, more than any other shipbuilding complex on Earth, at 2/3 the time and 1/4 the cost of the industry average. On some days, Richmond launches 3 ships before sundown. Each of those ships carries a world inside its hull. The manifest of the SS John W. Brown runs to 61 pages, listing over 2,500 separate items. TNT, Sherman tanks, a locomotive, Purple Heart medals, cigarettes and skirts for female officers. A Liberty ship can hold 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition. At $1.8 million per vessel, a Liberty ship only has to complete 1 voyage to justify its cost. If a U-boat sinks it, the replacement is already sliding down the slipway. Those ships go everywhere the war demands. Through the Murmansk run to the Soviet Union, 15,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, 350,000 tons of explosives, 15 million pairs of boots, to Normandy on June 6, 1944. Where roughly 2,700 merchant vessels participate in D-Day, the majority of them Liberty ships. The SS Robert E. Peary itself runs a shuttle service from Cardiff to Omaha Beach beginning June 7th, carrying troops and equipment under continuous fire until September. Albert Speer watches all of this. As Hitler's Minister of Armaments, he understands exactly what Kaiser has accomplished, and he tries to replicate it. Germany's next-generation submarine, the Type 21, is designed for prefabricated construction. Sections manufactured at 11 inland factories, shipped by canal to 3 coastal assembly yards, welded together in a fraction of the traditional time. It is Kaiser's method applied to U-boats. The result is a disaster. Sections arrive warped, misaligned, riddled with defects. Dozens of Type 21 boats are assembled. Most never leave port. The few that reach the sea are plagued with mechanical failures. Not a single Type 21 fires a torpedo in combat before the war ends. Germany attempts to copy the system that is burying it. Germany fails, and that failure says more about what Kaiser built than any production statistic ever could. 3 ships a day, 2,710 by war's end. The numbers are staggering, but numbers do not bleed. The workers who built those ships labored 8 to 10-hour shifts 6 and 7 days a week, inside yards where the air tasted of welding flux and steel dust. Welders' flash, a burn to the cornea caused by ultraviolet light from the arc, was so common that Kaiser's yard hospitals treated it as routine. Asbestos lined the engine rooms and boiler compartments of every Liberty ship. The workers who installed it had no masks. Thousands would develop lung disease in the decades after the war, long after the last ship slid down the ways and the yards fell silent, and the men who sailed those ships faced something worse. A Liberty ship cruised at 11 knots. A surfaced U-boat could make 17. The ships carried no armor. Their 9 defensive guns were operated by 20 naval armed guards, most of them teenagers fresh from training. If a torpedo struck, the crew had minutes. If the cargo was ammunition or fuel, they had seconds. The only medical officer aboard held the rating of pharmacist's mate, with 4 months of training. If a man lost a leg in the engine room, the pharmacist's mate was all he had. The men who worked below the waterline knew the arithmetic of survival better than anyone. Harold Wellington, a merchant marine engine room crewman, described it decades later while standing in the boiler room of the surviving Liberty ship SS John W. Brown. If a ship were to be hit by a torpedo, the water would pour in on top of the men in the engine room and they would not get out. 40 feet below the waterline. No escape hatch, no time. The U.S. Merchant Marine served 243,000 men during the war. 9,521 of them died. The casualty rate, 1 in 26, was the highest of any American service in World War II, higher than the Marines, higher than the Army, higher than the Navy that was supposed to protect them, and when the survivors came home, they received nothing. No GI Bill, no veteran status, no benefits. The men who had delivered the war across every ocean were classified as civilians. It would take 43 years, until 1988, before Congress granted them official recognition as veterans. By then, most were dead. Back in Richmond, the price took a different form. Mary Carroll arrived at Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation in 1942. She was not young, she was not trained. She came because her 27-year-old son had been killed at the Battle of Bataan in the Philippines. She did not want wages. She wanted to build something that would carry other mothers' sons to the war that took hers. Every weld she laid was personal. Eastine Kauner had been a waitress. At Kaiser's Richmond yard, she became a scaler on the SS George Washington Carver, one of 17 Liberty ships named for African Americans. She was also a member of Boilermakers Auxiliary, a 36, a segregated union local created specifically because the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers refused to grant black workers full membership. Auxiliary members could pay dues. They could not vote. They could not file grievances. They could not advance. In Oregon, more than 300 black workers were fired for refusing to join the auxiliary. It took a California Supreme Court ruling in 1945 to strike down the practice. 1.8 million Americans worked in Liberty shipyards during the war. 30% were women, 10% were African American. Many had never held an industrial job, many had never left their home state. Kaiser recruited them from cotton fields in Mississippi, from church kitchens in Alabama, from reservations in the Southwest. He built them a city, gave them a paycheck, and put a welding torch in their hands. The social revolution was real. It was also incomplete, compromised, and painful at every step. January 1943, Portland, Oregon. The SS Schenectady sits at her outfitting berth. She is brand new. Her paint is fresh. Her hull has never touched open water. And then the U.S. Coast Guard investigation report records what happens next. Without warning, and with a report which was heard for at least a mile, the deck and sides of the vessel fractured just after the bridge superstructure. The fracture extended almost instantaneously to the turn of the bilge port and starboard. The ship's deck, side shells, longitudinal bulkheads and bottom girders all crack. Only the bottom plating holds. The vessel jackknifes, its center section rising clear of the water while the bow and stern settle into the river mud. Workers on the night shift watch a completed vessel split like a broken spine. No torpedo, no storm, no impact of any kind. Just cold air and steel that has forgotten how to bend. And the Schenectady is not alone. Over the following months, Liberty ships begin cracking across the North Atlantic. Nearly 1,500 cases of significant brittle fracture are recorded during the war. 12 ships break completely in two without warning. The SS John P. Gaines splits apart off the Aleutian Islands on November 24, 1943. 10 men die in water just above freezing. The cause is the dark side of everything that made Kaiser's revolution possible. The steel used in Liberty ships, when cooled below a critical temperature, transitions from ductile to brittle. It does not bend, it snaps. And because the hulls are welded rather than riveted, a crack that starts at a stress point can propagate across the entire vessel with nothing to stop it. In a riveted ship, Each plate is a separate piece of metal, a crack stops at the edge. In a welded ship, the hull is one continuous sheet of steel, a crack stops at nothing. Fast construction, cheap steel, simple welds, square hatches, the same choices that let Kaiser build a ship in 4 days are now killing the men who sail them. The crisis threatens more than individual ships. In February 1944, the US Coast Guard recommends pulling Liberty ships from troop transport duty. If the recommendation goes through, the Allied shipping pool loses hundreds of vessels at the worst possible moment. D-Day is 4 months away. Eisenhower needs every hull that floats. A fleet that cracks in cold water cannot carry an invasion across the English Channel. For the first time since the Tonnage War turned in favor of the Allies, the math wobbles. Not because of U-boats, because of metallurgy. But the engineers respond faster than the steel fails. Constance Tipper, a researcher at Cambridge University, identifies the root cause. The steel itself undergoes a ductile to brittle transition at low temperatures. The problem is not the welds. The problem is what the welds are holding together. Riveted steel straps are retrofitted along the hulls as crack arresters, breaking the continuous weld path so that a fracture cannot run the full length of the ship. Square hatch corners are redesigned with rounded edges. Welding standards are tightened, routes are adjusted to avoid the coldest waters where possible. The rate of serious brittle fracture drops from 4.3 per 100 ship years to 0.5. The fleet does not shrink, it stabilizes, and then it grows again. May 1943. 41 U-boats destroyed in 31 days, more than in all previous years of the war combined. Dönitz withdraws his submarines from the North Atlantic. The supply line between North America and Britain is open. It will never close again. Winston Churchill had written 6 words that defined the weight of this moment better than any statistic. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. He no longer needs to be frightened, not because the U-boats have disappeared, because the ships have become unstoppable. 2,710 Liberty ships built. Only 200 lost to enemy action. 99% of all convoy ships crossing the Atlantic arrived safely throughout the entire war. Before the war, the United States controlled 14% of the world's merchant tonnage. After the war, 60%. No single weapon produced that shift. No battle decided it. A production method did. A dam builder looked at a ship and saw an assembly line. And the resistance that had kept ships out of the water for centuries, the insistence that shipbuilding was a craft, not an industry, collapsed in 4 years under the weight of welded steel and 2-week training programs. But production is not the same as justice. Vice Admiral Emery S. Land, who as chairman of the Maritime Commission had overseen the construction of every Liberty ship, watched the men who sailed them return to silence. No parades, no pensions, no place in the national memory. He wrote what Congress would take 4 decades to acknowledge. When we realize that over and over again they land from one torpedoed ship, and as soon as they recover from wounds or exposure they start on another trip, we can hardly fail to pay homage for supreme courage. Land paid homage, the government did not. The merchant mariners who crewed those ships were classified as civilians until 1988. By then, most had already been buried without the veterans' flag they had earned. The yards left behind more than ships. The migration that Kaiser set in motion, hundreds of thousands of African Americans moving from the rural South to the industrial West Coast, reshaped the demographics of California permanently. The fights over segregated Union locals at Richmond and Portland became early skirmishes of the civil rights movement. The prepaid healthcare system Kaiser designed for his workers outlived every ship they built. It is still operating today under the name Kaiser Permanente. Dönitz built his Tonnage War on a single assumption: production has a ceiling. He was right about every nation on Earth except one. The thing that broke his strategy was not a code, not a radar set, not a depth charge. It was a man who built dams looking at a cargo ship and deciding it was just another construction problem. And it was a waitress from Richmond who picked up a scaling hammer, and a mother from Oregon who picked up a welding torch because her son never came home from Bataan. In January 1942, Captain Lieutenant Hardigan looked at the American coast and saw a nation asleep. He was right. But what he did not see, what no one in Berlin or Lorient or the Wolf's Lair could have seen, was how fast that nation builds when it wakes up.